Compliance or cooperation? How do you want to get results? Whether it's an interrogation, an investigative interview, a workplace dispute, or a difficult conversation in your personal life, there's an underlying foundation of empathy and strategic preparation needed. In this episode, we'll discuss all the above and more with our guest, James Harris. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Welcome to the Truth Be Told podcast. Our guest today is James Harris, Senior Lecturer at Canterbury Christ Church University and Course Director for the Criminal Investigation Program. James has also dedicated over a decade to law enforcement, primarily as a detective with the City of London Police. In this capacity, James held various investigative roles, including major crimes investigations, ranging from homicides to complex frauds. James also served a role as a strategic interview advisor, currently serves on the board of the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group, and has been recognized for his role in the investigation into the 2017 Borough Market attack. James has specialized training in interviewing techniques and will discuss concepts like achieving best evidence and WISCI, Witness Interview Strategy for Critical Incidents. Thanks for listening as we explore the foundation of effective communication through the experience and insight of Mr. James Harris. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am with my good friend from across the pond, Mr. James Harris. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, Dave. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to have a conversation with you and you to join us. And I know you've got some extensive, unique experience in policing, and then the last few years entered the academic community as a senior lecturer. So it'd be kind of interesting to hear, how you went from a career pathing from law enforcement to in the classroom, and what's that been like? Do you miss it, first of all?
I don't miss rolling around on the street with people and night shifts. I think my body's probably a lot better.
Right.
I got into like cop shows after I left the police. I never watched them when I was in the police, really. And I was remember there's a scene, it's one called Blue Bloods, obviously an American one.
Yep.
And the commissioner, Tom Selleck, the character, his character, is the commissioner, and his daughter says, "Oh, you miss it, don't you?" And he said, I miss the idea, I don't miss the reality. And I always thought that was a good way to summarise my view. The idea is still there, but actually the reality of it was great at the time, but no, I'm happier outside it, but still having some input on it. I think that's the best way I like to do it.
How, when you're watching, especially American police TV shows, does it terrify you to what the depiction of law enforcement actually looks like on TV?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate to work. I've been on training courses in the States with the Department of Justice, with the HIG, the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. I was very fortunate. So I know people in US law enforcement. So I have some personal experience to that degree. But yeah, I mean, obviously they're represented for a commercial market. It's the same here. We have some very popular like cop shows, like Line of Duty is one that became quite famous. I think it was on the iPlayer BBC, and you'd watch that and you'd just be like, God, it's just so far removed, especially like the interviews. It would just make you laugh, but it's for a market, isn't it? So you've got to. But yeah, they all terrify me to a degree, because that's what people believe they're like.
Right.
When they finally do come to have some contact with the police, that's their rule of thumb. That's what they think they're like. So you have to sort of change that. So.
Yeah, Law and Order is not it's not a as seen on TV type of profession. So for our listeners that have probably picked up on your accent at this point, can give us a little kind of background on where you're from and when you were at least in policing, where you were based out of, and then where you're at now.
Yeah, so obviously I'm a Englishman, or British, whatever way you want to go with that. Born and bred in London, so southeast London. I grew up in, and I joined the police initially in a sort of what we call like a staff role, a civilian role when I was 19. You can join the police here young at 18 and a half, but I wasn't 100% sure it was for me. I had family, a multi-generational policing family. My mum's side, my great-grandfathers had been police officers in London during the Second World War, so they avoided conscription because policing here was what they call like a reserved occupation. And then my granddad, my mum's brother-in-law were all in the Metropolitan Police, which most people would probably know, the sort of the London, the Met. And then I joined as a staff member what we call the City of London Police, which is, if you try and think of what most foreigners, I guess, would think of London, like Big Ben, the West End. London is actually made up of 32 boroughs, and that's like Greater London, as we would call it. And then the core historic centre of London, which was where the Romans sort of set up their first sort of establishments in England, that's called the City of London. It's a separate area to the rest of London. It's unique. It's got its own mayor. It's got its own corporation and things like that. So they've historically always had their own police force since 1820 or something like that. So I never really heard of them, but I wanted to join the Met, but they weren't. My application was taking too long, so because I was already in the City Police as a staff member, I joined the City of London Police. So I was 22 at that point, and yeah, I was there all in all until 2022, give or take. I had a year out in between. I went to work at a university for a year and came back for another 6 months. And yeah, on the whole, had a great time. Some tough times, but yeah, just sort of reached a period in time where I was at a bit of a crossroads in professional career, and just decided that actually I had an opportunity to move into an academic role, which I'm now in. But also I get to do some private training as well. So yeah, that's sort of how I ended up here. And along the way I did quite a few good things in the police. Spent most of my time as a detective, which in England's a bit different to America. It's not really a promotion. So we have like career paths. So you sort of can stay in the uniform route as a constable, sergeant, inspector, or you can go in the investigative route, which is the detective acronym on your name, but you're not paid more, which often people go, why do I do this? I don't think you get paid anymore. But it's a choice in terms of your work. And I worked in general, what we call CID, which is sort of general criminal investigation, major crime for the city. So some murders, complex fraud, sexual assaults, and then I did training at the end as well in sort of normal investigations training, but also more specialist economic crime, which the City of London Police is probably most famous for, sort of as the national lead for fraud in this country.
That's really interesting. So you didn't leave, or you didn't take that career path only because you wanted to get out of that uniform?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
Yeah.
it just wasn't for me. God, no. I used to sort of walk around, and in England you have the big hat. Male officers have the big tall hat, and it just wasn't for me. It's not because I think it's meaningless work. It is a really, really important job, and when you were investigating crime, and we'll probably touch it, actually the most important people in investigation often are the first responders, and the questions that they ask, call handlers even. So I didn't undermine the work, it was just I wanted a bit more, and I would respond to incidents as a first responder, and we would sort of hand it over to somebody else, and we would go back out, and I was always thinking, I wonder how they did that. I'd come in the next day and they'd charge somebody with GBH, and I'd go, I wonder how they managed to do that. So I was perhaps a bit more of a slower time. I like to go into the detail, as opposed to being sort of proactive. I think that was just a personal choice. That was really it. But yeah,
Yeah, and
uniform wasn't my
not
thing.
not just the hat. Yeah, yeah. We one of our guests last year, I think Bruce Pitt Payne, but he was a former RCMP officer, so I had to poke a little bit fun at their. I don't know who has the better uniform. They
I
got the
think
red coat, so
their dress uniform's
y-
pretty cool. Yeah, the sort of
yeah.
it was quite cool watching the Queen's funeral last year. The Mounties actually were at the front of the procession, but they probably win on the uniform front, actually, I would say.
Yeah. Well, what's kind of neat about your career path, and obviously, if your passion in that detective work was on the investigative front, and you mentioned, gathering information and interviewing, and so I know now you're doing some training, and you're also a senior lecturer. And so, what are some of the courses that you're teaching? Like, what's the core topic that you like to focus on? What drives your passion?
So my background really in policing, I specialise, and I think we'll come on to it, like investigative interviewing. Obviously, I know that's a lot of the topic here, and in policing we had almost a career path or a structure for interviewers, which was quite unique here. And I sort of always interested in interviewing, despite the fact the first ever interview I didn't say a word. I arrested somebody for a drugs offence, and we handed it over to the detectives. And the detective said to me, "You're going to have to come in with me. That's the rule." And he turned to me and halfway through and said, "Oh, is there any questions?" And I was like, no. And he scolded me for that. And he said, "You should always have a question." And I thought, I'll never be able to do this. And then what was cool, I was only thinking about this last week actually, I ended up 10 years later leading an interview with a murder suspect, and he was my second interviewer. So I was just like, how mad.
That's great.
10 years before he scolded me for not speaking, 10 years later I was the lead interviewer and he was helping me. So
That's
I'd always
fast.
become
Did
interested.
he ask a question as the
He did,
second?
yeah, he did. I scolded him. um,
Yeah.
but that became
Okay.
my passion.
That's
Like
really neat.
I enjoyed that, and I became what we call an interview advisor, which was the top level of interviewer in this country, and that was a strategic role, which I advised senior investigating officers on how to conduct interviews with suspects and witnesses. So it always was a passion of mine, and I said I got to go to the States and do stuff with the HIG. So moving into academia, that was obviously a natural thing to carry on. So my courses all are around policing, criminal investigation. So I lead modules around major crime investigation, how the police investigate major crime, some of the challenges that have come across that in this country. But I do a whole module on investigative interviewing as well. So I start that in the second semester in the new year. So we talk all about the history of interviewing in this country, because England's gone on a long journey to get to where it is now. We talk about all sorts of things, false confessions, how they happen, are they real, and the students sort of go, oh, by the end of the module they realise people do confess to things they wouldn't do. So we offer them to a range of students from different courses, and they're always really, really popular. So yeah, it's nice to be able to bring that practitioner and obviously also the academic elements together, and I think having been there and done it, you're in a good position to sort of share that with the students.
Yeah, that's great. And we're gonna dive into that interview advisor role a little bit, because I think um, it's really interesting, and it translates well to even the corporate world, right? Of whether it's an interview or it's just kind of strategizing a conversation with your boss or your colleague or somebody who works for you, is thinking ahead of time about objectives and obstacles and those types of things. But before we get into it, I'm curious how much you feel like your time in the law enforcement space, and what you learned about communicating under maybe more high tense, high pressure situations. How has that helped you in your academic career, working with other professors or students or parents or whoever else you might interact with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when you're in the police, I think not they do a good job, but you do a good job yourself of convincing yourself that nothing's transferable. All those skills are unique to policing, and they can't be used elsewhere. And I think what most police officers develop is good communication skills. And if you look at any sort of research around what makes a good detective, what skills are needed, universally, almost every time, it's communication and decision making. They're the two skills that get mentioned, and I think you can transfer them into any walk of life. And I think what helps me outside the police now, and it took a while because I was probably fairly institutionalised. If you've been in a career from school age, you struggle with that. But it's about putting things in context. Situations that other people might think this is really big situation. Oh my God, we need to panic, and you're sort of like, well, I'm not sure. Let's all just slow things down. Let's just talk it through. And I think making decisions in sort of stressful situations is important. Communicating, I think, is really a big thing for me. Not just students, staff, it's anyone, but it's. I think using the right questions and sort of questioning strategies, often to get people to get the right answer themselves. So my sort of philosophy with students is, they come to me for help. I don't want to tell them the answer. I want them to develop the answer themselves. So asking a series of questions, and I know the background around things like leading questions, which are obviously in general are bad, but leading questions to students to get them to navigate to the answer that they perhaps already thought, and they just want you to sort of affirm it for them. So I think those sort of communication skills, the ability to have empathy, you spend time with people in horrible situations, the worst times of their life in the police, so you can see the world through their eyes. So if a student is having a tough time, you might in your eyes you might go, well, in the context of the world that seems fairly minor, but to them that's quite a big thing. So trying to be empathetic to them, like, right, what are they possibly feeling, and again just sort of helping them to help themselves through the right questions. I think that's a skill I'm glad I brought with me out of the police, I think.
Yeah, empathy. I've written that down in a few different topics I wanted to cover, but it really is a core foundation. It seems like for effective communication with every guest we have, whether it's talking to a victim, witness, or even a suspect of a crime, talking to a coworker, a family member. But I think some people struggle with this balance, and maybe you can talk through this of having empathy without maybe feeling like you're being soft, or having empathy without feeling like you're justifying something. And I think there's a really good discussion there on the importance of respect and rapport. It doesn't really mean that we're being either soft on crime or not holding people accountable.
Yeah, I think people mix or blend empathy in with sympathy, without really understanding what empathy is. Empathy isn't just, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. It must be terrible to be you. Like, that is an element of empathy, because you're trying to. I don't know what you're feeling, but the way you've described it, if I put myself in your shoes, I can understand why you would be sad. That is a form of empathy, but a lot of empathy is just trying to understand the world that the person in front of you sees. So it doesn't have to be about sorrow or feeling bad. Empathy can be, this is the way they see the world. So, for example, if you're interviewing a terrorist, we had a really horrible terror attack in here about 12 years ago now, where a British soldier was killed on the streets of Woolwich, South London, and it was filmed. And the guy who did it, Michael Adebolajo, he talked on national television about why he did it, and how he saw himself as a soldier, and that the victim, Lee Rigby, was a legitimate target because he was a soldier, and it was all to do with Britain's involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't agree with anything that man said, and what he's done is so reprehensible. But if I was interviewing him, it's about to build rapport with him. How does he see the world? Well, he clearly sees the world that Britain is the enemy, this soldier was a legitimate target. So I don't have to be justifying what he says, and it's not condoning it, but it's just trying to understand, right, he sees the world in this particular way. In his eyes, this is legitimate. So to build rapport with him and to get him to talk by judging him and sort of saying, well, my standards, I don't agree with you, it's not going to go anywhere. So I think that's the biggest challenge people have empathy, is they immediately go to, well, I have to sympathise. No, empathy and sympathy are completely different. But empathy is about putting yourself in their shoes, and not just how they feel, but how they see things. So they might see the world completely different to you, but you've got to try and understand that. And if you understand that, or try to, then you're going to get somewhere with that person, I think.
That's a perfect example. As you were talking through that, I think when I watch interviews, especially in the law enforcement space, I feel like investigators often take on this role of judgment in the interview, right? It's almost like we take on this responsibility of, during the interview, this person's done something wrong, and you want them to know they did something wrong. And I think it's this like just innate, I want to make sure they know what they did was wrong. That is the complete opposite approach that you want to have, right? It's contradictory, because what you just said, I can imagine interviewing somebody like him or interviewing somebody who's committed some terrible crime and being able to give them the space to talk about why they did it is so important to collect information, but it seems so contradictory when you have this like emotion against what they did. Any thoughts on that, or how do you balance that when you're in that
Well,
position?
I think the key, so perhaps the ability here, and maybe it's because of our very strict laws around conducting interviews and detention of prisoners, um, and the strict laws around admissibility of the confession if it were to occur. You'll be very careful about the line you tread, and if you were to come across as judgmental, oppressive, then the interview itself, because every interview in this country by the police is recorded under the law, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, it's going to be thrown out of court. So there's no point going down that road. I think the key here is, and I certainly always felt this, and I hope everyone else does, but it's what's your job as an interviewer. Your job isn't to get a confession. Like, you should recognise the benefits of a confession. It saves time, money for a victim. They don't have to go through the trauma of a trial, maybe, but it shouldn't be the goal. And I think it's about understanding, as an interviewer, my job is to go, right, the interview is a piece of a puzzle, a very large puzzle, and I'm going to do an investigation. There's going to be other lines of inquiry, there's going to be other interviews, forensic investigation, CCTV, everything. It's this suspect's opportunity to give some information about that incident, what they can tell us. If they choose not to talk to us, that's their right to do so. I don't need the interview. I've got the other evidence. It's my job is to present that evidence to the prosecutors, and they'll make a decision as to whether they charge them or not. And if it goes to court, if they answered all my questions, no comment, or they told an absolute pack of lies that's inconsistent with the evidence, I'll let the jury hear that, and the jury can make their own decision. It's that ability to remove yourself sort of emotionally from the case and go, well, this is not my job. And it's very hard in victim-based crimes, because obviously you feel a degree of challenge for the victim. I want to get justice, but I always had the opinion of, well, what if the person sat across the desk is innocent? What if they're innocent? And if I show judgment, even if they stick out their hand and say, oh, I say, hi, I'm James, I've come to interview you, and they stick their hand out and I don't shake it, they straight away form the judgment, well, he's clearly made his mind up that I'm guilty, so what's the point of talking to him? So it's hard. I think it's just about retaining balance, objectivity, and I think not over relying on what an interview is. Don't think it's the be all end all of an investigation. It's just another part of it.
Yeah, I think the one of the many points you just made that I want to make sure listeners hear, no matter if they're investigators or not, but the confession isn't the goal. And to me, it's the same as a salesperson, right? I know it might feel like the sale is the goal, right? Getting the contract signed, whatever it might be. But anybody pressured into that end game or that result is eventually going to become resistant or maybe just be compliant. And instead, we want cooperative. And there's a big difference between compliance and cooperation. And that's what you're talking about, is how do we just kind of create a platform to make people talk?
Yeah, and make a decision that they want to make. Give them the opportunity, and like you say, any walk of life. If you're a salesperson trying to get somebody to buy a car, present them with the facts. The offer, the specs of the car. How it's going to be a better improvement. But if you oversell it, oh, you've got to buy this, you've got to buy this. Actually, you're starting to annoy me now. I did come in here, and I actually had this a while ago. I was interested in buying a car, and they went for the hard sell, and I was just like, I don't want to buy a car off you anymore because you're annoying me.
Right.
So it's give them the information, see, what is this person? Why do they need a new car? What is their budget? Be realistic about it, and it's about letting them make an informed choice, and that's the same as an interview. I'm showing you the evidence, I'm showing you the fingerprints that we've taken from a murder weapon that's got your fingerprints on it in a high stakes, but or in a corporate investigation world, in a loss prevention world, the same thing. I'm showing you the evidence that is a strong indicator that you've got an involvement in this case, but then that's their decision to whether they want to tell you something. If they don't want to say anything, you have to respect that. They have to have the autonomy to make that decision for themselves. Otherwise, it's not a true sort of reflection of what they want to say.
Right. I want to go back to when you kind of first started in the law enforcement space. So you're out there on the streets working with the community every single day, and in my experience in London and in that region, it's very diverse, right? When, even when you say diverse, it seems like it feels different saying that in the States versus when you're in Europe. It's always so amazing to me that, you go to London, it seems like everybody's travels to 5 different countries over the summer for vacation or for holiday. And here that's such an extravagant thing. But you get people from all walks of life. And I imagine that's got to play a role in either interview strategy or at least how you're interacting with people, is kind of being aware of the diversity of culture and life experience. What have you learned anything from that when you were in that role or experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, where I policed was sort of central London, so we would have obviously white collar people, big FTSE 100 companies. You would also have people coming in for the nightlife in the evening, tourists, and then on sort of Friday and Saturday evenings, the demographic would change dramatically when sort of bars and restaurants turned into sort of like nightclubs essentially, and then a completely different demographic would come in to London, sort of promoted events from all sort of different backgrounds, and some of those backgrounds historically have had very bad relations with the police, and that's been the police's fault, not that community. So we had a very famous murder in London in 1993 of a young man called Stephen Lawrence. Changed the way the police were seen in London. They were branded by a High Court judge to be institutionally racist. I should stress, not the City of London Police. This was the Met. But that transcends into communities and generations. So to your point, I would be on a Saturday, on a Friday morning, perhaps speaking to somebody who works in insurance and maybe has sort of been accused of stealing something from an office, and then on a Saturday night I might be interviewing somebody from a part of South London, for example, and they've historically, have a great distrust of the police. They hate the police. Their relatives, they might have been stop and search disproportionately compared to young white men as opposed to young black men. Statistically in London, the stats will tell you that will happen. So yeah, again, it's about being empathetic. Just to give you an example, I worked on an attempted murder, and we went to interview somebody, and we traced him as a witness, and he wouldn't speak to us. He wouldn't give an official statement, and that was because of the way growing up and his interactions with the police and how he felt he'd been discriminated against. So it was nothing we could do. So you're sitting there listening to it. It's obviously sad to hear, but putting yourself in his shoes, being empathetic, I can understand why he felt that way. So you can't go in there judgmental and say, oh, we're going to be really different this time. Well, you're trying to change years of sort of attitude. So yeah, London is an incredibly diverse city, and that presents a number of challenges.
Yeah, and that example you gave, what I've seen in a lot of cases, and even a lot of our guests have talked about this, is too many people are focused on what somebody's maybe behavior, physical or not even verbal behavior looks or sounds like, and they kind of instinctively use that to classify somebody as guilty or not. And we know that the science completely debunks that theory. But what you just said, I think is important for people to think about, right? If you're interviewing this person who's a potential witness, and they are resistant based off of other kind of situational factors that have nothing to do with maybe that case, that person may come across resistant, maybe nervous, maybe closed off, and the interviewer may misread that as guilt when it's for something completely different.
Yeah, or just they're being difficult. They're sort of anti-police. Like, they're not anti-police. They've had an experience which meant something to them, and that's going to impact on the way they consider things going forward. And it's the same. You can transfer it into other walks of life. If you've had a bad experience in a workplace investigation, you were treated really badly by HR. It was in your eyes, a bias investigation. You didn't get due process followed. You move to a different organisation and you're asked to sort of assist with a HR matter. You're going to take that with you, aren't you? That shaped who you are. And then when HR said, "Oh, we're here to do an open and transparent process," and you're like, "Oh, they said that last time, and that didn't happen. So I've got a distrust of HR investigation." So yeah, to the HR investigator, you look at this like really obstructive member of staff who sort of doesn't want to help. It's like, well, no, actually, your experiences shape you, and I think that's where empathy comes back in. It's okay, you tell me that, so you tell me your experience of what happened, and I can't change your mind if you're going to stick to that, but I can perhaps see where you're coming from, and I can try and explain to you why it's going to be different this time, and then perhaps that will encourage you to engage. But ultimately, like I say, it's your decision whether you want to participate in this process. But if you come across as judgy, forceful, I'm definitely not going to engage with you, am I?
Well, and so that brings me to another point. Is sometimes in the investigative space, or really, I guess, in any industry, but probably more so in law enforcement, sometimes you have to balance assertiveness with empathy, right? Because you still need to be in control of a conversation or a situation. And so, I think my last trip to London was I went to go watch football, American football, I should clarify, American football up at the Tottenham Stadium, which was really cool and orderly. But I was just, as I'm there, I'm thinking, there's pubs up and down the street like crazy. They're surrounding the stadium. People are taking the train in and out, or the overground or the underground. So it's easy for people to drink a lot, not worry about driving. But also, I got to imagine when you're at a football match and there's tens of thousands of people and competing rivals, it's got to get a little crazy. And so any experience in that space, and how do you, whether it's that example or a different one, but how do you manage kind of being assertive and control, but also still having empathy in that moment?
Yeah, I've never policed football events or anything like that. I've been to games, obviously. They're
So you're one of the suspects then that needs to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really. I love football. Absolutely love it. I don't really enjoy going to the games though. Not really my scene. Sort of tens of thousands of people all together, as you say, under influences of things. But I think the way I look at it, we were talking about this, me and a colleague the other day, is it's where you go in at. If you, I think a lot of people think about sort of English policing, particularly like interviews, is we're a bit soft. Sometimes you have to be firm, and of course you do. You have to be assertive. In law enforcement, you have to. But I think it's about, do you go in up here, and you can never really come down from there. So if you go in straight away of, listen to me, this is what you got to do, almost effing and blinding, very, very difficult to then lower the temper down. And I think it's all about, again, like a bit of empathy. So like maybe you're trying to keep the away fan. I'm just sort of hypothesising here, but you're trying to keep the away fans. They're coming out of one tube station. You're trying to keep them away from the home supporters, because obviously that could lead to conflict. You might be penning the away supporters in. They might have been on the train for ages. They might need the toilet. They're claustrophobic. But it's about sort of, I can understand. I can see why you feel the way you feel. But I need you to listen to me. Like, this is for your safety. This is for everyone's safety. And then if they don't respond to that, I've gone in at a respectful level. I've respected you. I understand how you feel. But because I've gone in there, if they don't correlate to that, I can then go up to here, and that's when I can be, right, you've been warned, and that's when sort of you can almost justify that sort of more forceful. But I think when you see police officers here, and you see it on social media and stories, that they end up looking a bit silly, and because they've gone in, almost like red mist themselves, and they've just gone in there, and you can't de-escalate that. You've almost created the situation yourself by going at such a sort of intense level.
Yeah, I think, and that, to me, that ties right back to what you said before. It's more about cooperation versus compliance, right? How do we get people to understand why we're providing that direction versus just follow that direction? And I
Yeah,
think you have more long term.
I want you to cooperate. Like, I'd like you to do what I say, so I'm going to ask you to do it nicely. But ultimately, this is going to happen. But I don't want to have to make you comply. I will if I have to, but if I go in straight away saying you're going to comply with what I say, it breeds resentment, and that's in any, obviously the situation we're just talking about football, but in work, you know, when we ask people to go along with us on work projects, you're going to comply with this. Well, I don't understand why you're asking me to do it. Like you say, I want you to cooperate. I want you to come on the journey with me. But ultimately, if you want to be difficult about it, we can escalate it. But that's like last resort, I think.
It sounds like talking to my 6 and 4-year-old nephews.
Yeah.
The same thing, right? You tell them what to do, they're going to have a reason they don't want to do it. But if they realize it's part of their idea or they understand why they have to do it, they're more bought into the process.
Yeah, exactly. And we used to have this thing called in public order training, like called the 5-step appeal. And it was like you would start by saying, you know, you need to move. You're blocking the road. Is there anything I can do to get you to move the road? No. And then you sort of escalate it, you know, do you understand if you don't move, you could get arrested? Step 3, and then step 4 is, look, I've given you one final chance, but if you don't move, I am going to move you and it's going to cause you pain. So when if they were to complain later that, you know, you were heavy-handed, I gave you every opportunity, you know, rather than just going in and sort of using pressure points and bending arms. The news story is police are heavy-handed. If you'd have just asked me to move, I would have moved. Well, actually, I asked you 4 times, and you didn't move. So, yeah, it's never about being overtly soft. It's just not going in up here. It's start here, and then you can move up to there if you need to.
Yeah. Well, I like that. Having structure and a system and a process can help make communication a little more objective, a little more consistent. And I know, so to your role as an advisor, that was really part of the focus, is how do we get some consistency across interviews, but also put some strategy into the conversation or the planning ahead of time. A lot of times people feel like an interview is, 90% the interview. But I really feel like strong interviews and investigations are all about the planning and preparation beforehand. So I guess maybe high level, what is that role of an interview advisor? What are some of the main things you're looking at in that role?
Yeah, so we sort of run major investigations here. You have a senior officer called the senior investigating officer, who's normally quite a senior ranking officer. And whilst they're in charge of an investigation, they're not experts in everything. So not acronym, sorry, but the way I use it is, if they turned up at a murder scene and there's potentially lots of forensic opportunities, they bring in the sort of what we call the crime scene manager, and the crime scene manager will advise them on the best forensic strategy. It's the same for interviews. So if you had, a suspect with particular vulnerabilities, or you would want to bring in an interview advisor who has sort of done a course where they explore things around different interview strategies, communication strategies. If you've got multiple suspects, what order do you interview the suspects in? What information are you going to disclose to the suspects? Are you going to hold particular information back? And picking the right interviewers. So the interview advisor would be responsible for making sure that those who are going to conduct the interview are the right people, they've had the right training, perhaps they've got the right characteristics, because not everyone is the right interviewer. I think that's I've learned that over the years. But then it's also about witnesses as well. So actually, you would be responsible for, say the SIO came to you and said, James, there's been this incident outside a football stadium. We think there was around 1,000 people in the vicinity at the time. How should we go about, capturing evidence from them? How do we organise that? What order do we do it in? Do we need to interview everyone? So you would come up with a strategy around, sort of, obviously it'd be based on the facts of the case, but it's about sort of working out where your resources are needed the most. What witnesses are probably going to be the most important to you, and sort of prioritising them over others perhaps. And then lastly, it'd be sort of about evaluating the product. So evaluating the suspect interviews, evaluating the witness interviews, how does that feed into the overall investigation? And yeah, you sort of monitor, so you could monitor the interviews as well. So it was a different role to an interviewer because you weren't actually doing the interviews, so sometimes it was a bit hard. But it was much more of a sort of strategic role, and each force would have one, or at least not one. You know, God, the Met's probably got dozens, if not hundreds, of Tier 5 interview advisors, or Tier 5s they were called. So yeah, I don't actually think, I tried to find out in other countries if any there's a similar role anywhere. I don't think there is. It seems to be quite unique to this country. I think I take that back. The Garda, I know that in Ireland they have them, but other than that, I don't know anyone that does.
It's such an important role. I wish we had more of that in the States. I mean, the only comparison I can think of is there's a task force, or in some agencies, depending on the size, you have a homicide investigation. You might have a lead homicide investigator, but it's not specific just to interview strategy. It might be the entire case management, from press conferences to tasking out different duties throughout the investigation. But even if people, again, are in the corporate world, the law enforcement world, or even just thinking about how they're going to approach a friend or colleague about a difficult conversation, there's so much strategy that goes into it. And I feel like if we kicked off the episode talking about real, not true crime, but drama TV, dramatized kind of versions of law enforcement. And so if you watch that, you think, okay, what are the police thinking about beforehand? They're thinking, what evidence am I going to lie about? What secret trick am I going to use? What pressure can I apply? Do I leave the person alone for, a period of time? But in reality, what are some of the things that you're thinking about as far as execution of the interview?
Well, so it depends. For a suspect interview, I guess you want to look at who you're interviewing. So like you say, it doesn't really matter if it's a criminal matter or if it's a workplace matter, or you're planning to have a conversation with a member of staff. I always think in any line of investigative work, the focus should be on who is the person you're interviewing, because again, if it's about rapport based and empathetic, how are you going to understand the world that they see if you don't know about them? So, what can you learn about them? Obviously, you've got the basic characteristics, age, location, but previous offending. And, for example, if you were interviewing somebody with a long history of interactions with the police as a criminal record, they know the system, they know how this roughly works. So you can sort of probably make an educated guess that they're not going to find the situation intimidating. They're probably, I don't know if they'll be comfortable, but they won't be as uncomfortable. But if you're interviewing somebody who's never been in trouble with the police before, this might be the first time, or first time they've ever been in trouble with HR or at school, the first time they've been in trouble they are perhaps going to find that quite a stressful situation. So your role, when approaching that, would be about how can I don't want to say take advantage of that, but that was where perhaps you can make inroads and build rapport, because you can be seen as, this is what's going to happen. You've probably watched Line of Duty, where they're in a room and they're sort of bombarding them with questions. It's not going to be like that. Okay, my job's to listen to what you've got to say, not just to sort of bombard you with questions. So I think that's a really important place to start, is in any walk of life, who have you got in front of you? And then from there, really, I use this word, just fairness. I just think everything is about being fair. Giving that person, whether they are accused of the most heinous crime you can think of, or they're a witness to an incident, giving them the opportunity and the method and the environment to give their best information. Whether that's information you like or you don't like. I think that was always my method as an interview advisor, was to sort of, when I was talking to interviewers and I was talking to the SIOs, it was, what's the best method for capturing this that complies with the rule of law? We can't lie. We can't lie about evidence in this country. But it's about, how can I, if we've got forensic evidence, do I have to tell the suspect that I hold that? If they're innocent of the crime, they don't need to know that we've got all this evidence because they can just give us a truthful account. They don't need to know the specifics of the police investigation. So there's an element of tactical nous about it as well, but it was about being fair as well. I think if you're accusing people of crimes, they've got a right to know why they're there. If people are accused of workplace misconduct, they've got a right to know why they are there. And to walk away from that feeling, yeah, that was quite hard. Like, God, they asked some difficult questions. At times I felt a bit stressed. But you know what? They were fair. They did listen. They did listen to what I had to say. They asked me some difficult questions. They showed me some things. But I don't like the whole situation, but I can't criticise them too much. That was my approach.
Yeah, that's important too, especially if this is somebody who you may want to interact with again,
Yeah.
right? You mentioned kind of police community relationships before, but in any aspect, if you want to build a long-term relationship with the community or that person, is making sure you're being fair. And in that same role, or in your experience in the law enforcement space, I know there's a concept. I don't know if method's the right word, but the acronym is WISCI, and I'm not talking about the drink. Although maybe some people just finally started listening and they heard whiskey and now they're interested in the rest of the episode. But maybe it kind of explain to us, first of all, what the acronym stands for, and how that concept relates to an investigation.
Yeah, so it came. It's an open source paper. It's written by Professor Becky Milne, who fortunate to call a friend, who from the University of Portsmouth, but also sits on the National Investigative Interviewing Steering Group that we have in this country. And a guy called Kevin Smith, who is the National Crime Agency, so he's the national interview advisor. So I was an interview advisor in my force, he's the national one. And it was written sort of a combination of work around a growing number of incidents, what we would call critical incidents. So some of it was in relation to Toya in Norway, Anders Breivik, who carried out that horrific terror attack. And then obviously in London and other parts of England, in Manchester, in sort of 2016 to 2018, we had the Manchester Arena bombing, and then the 2 attacks in London, which I had some involvement in as well as a response. And it was about really just how do we gather information from witnesses in these massive witness incidents. So in the paper it talks about different areas such as, effectively a structured approach really for the police. But I think you can apply it to other lines of work as well. But it was about really, okay, so this critical incident's happened. I'm speculating now because obviously it had nothing to do with Ariel Grant, the arena investigation, but if you were to apply it to that, it's a critical incident because obviously the mass casualties, but also the mass number of witnesses, how many thousands of people were at that concert. Right, we've got to interview them, but who are our key witnesses here? So who's going to help us understand what happened? So WISCI talks about things like the key thing being categorization. So of those 1,000 witnesses, maybe, well, I can guarantee that not all 1,000 of them will provide anything of actually evidential value, but somewhere in that 1,000 are your key witnesses. And in this country, we have guidance around how to interview what we would call vulnerable or intimidated and significant witnesses. There's a documentation which is useful to anyone in the world. It's called Achieving Best Evidence in Criminal Proceedings. And that talks about video and audio recording witness interviews, but you should only use that for specific categories of witnesses. So you can't do that with 1,000 people. So again, it's about how do I get the critical, the most crucial witnesses. So categorization involves an element of triaging, getting initial accounts from people. In brief words, what was it that you saw, heard, smelt? Right, I can put you in category A. You heard this, you're in category B, you're in category C. Category A are my absolute key witnesses. They can help me understand what happened in the arena, how the bomb went off. They maybe saw something on the tube with the guy getting on the tube. So they need to be video recorded. They're going to have specially trained officers conduct cognitive interviews and things like that. Category C might be someone who said, well, I was at the concert but I didn't see anything. Right, we're going to record the fact that you were at the concert, but we're not going to dedicate a lot of resources to that because that's not as important. So that's sort of the crux of that side of it. And then it talks about things like understanding things like trauma, you know, how to interview traumatized witnesses. So a lot of research got done after the Atoya attacks and the survivors of that. You know, a trauma, and I know you guys at WZ do a lot of stuff around trauma-informed interviewing. So it's understanding, you know, if you're going to ask somebody to recall a traumatic incident, there's a good chance of re-traumatization. So it's about putting strategies in place for that afterwards, and it's about the capturing of that evidence and presenting it. So it's not, I wouldn't say, an official policy here. It's something that I've used, and I think it's publicly available knowledge that, you know, it's been used in other critical incidents in this country as a method by interview advisors. But it's just a useful, very, very, it's not even doing it justice really. It's a very effective way of managing mass witnesses when initially you just think, where do I start?
Right.
That's probably the best way I would describe it.
Well, and so the acronym is WISCI, right? WISCI?
It's Witness Interview Strategies for Critical Incidents. Yes, so
Perfect.
WISCI. So you can find, it's open source. It's a journal article by Becky and Kev. So it's not some sort of secret tactic or anything like that. And yeah, it's just a model and something that perhaps police forces, but also, you know, if you were, investigating a large workplace incident and, you know, you had over 200 employees, to go and video interview all 200 employees about something that happened is going to take a long, long time. So you might use the categorization element of WISCI to triage and go, right, I don't need to speak to those 50 people. And you create categories of witnesses within WISCI. That's sort of the way it's designed for.
Yeah, we'll link that paper in the show notes because I think it's a really good resource. And as you talked about the corporate world, you know, I'm thinking everything from, in the States, we've got mass shootings at a ridiculous frequency right now, but it could be in response to that. It could even be in response to, in the retail space, you got just any kind of public facing industry, you're going to have conflict between the consumer and the company. So whether it's a shoplifting or some type of fight or argument or whatever it might be, but you've got 30 employees around, this might be a good way to start to think, all right, how do I triage and prioritize who I'm going to talk to, and then how do I handle each conversation a little bit differently, because that can be overwhelming as a leader.
Yeah, and I think when you initially think, I've got, you know, oh James, there's 250 people that are possible witnesses, you start naturally, because you're a human being, just because you're in the police, you're still a human being, you start to panic and you think, how am I going to manage this? And it's about applying a logical sort of method to going about doing that. And yeah, I mean, I've used, WISCI, when you read, it's designed for in response to sort of these mass casualty events. And as you say, obviously, unfortunately, you have those incidents in America. You know, it would be perfect for the police there. You know, do I need to speak to all these people? Can I? Well, you know, I probably do need to speak to all of them, but who are my priorities in terms of capturing that material? But yeah, I've used the categorization in other investigations, you know, stuff that's happened in buildings, and, you know, there's like 500 people in the building, but we don't actually need to speak to all 500. So if we think about it logically and we categorize the people and we triage them, actually that 500 number suddenly gets reduced quite dramatically. And yeah, it's a tool. I think that's the way. It's not an official policy, but I think it will probably become that. And you know, I found an open source article that was talking about it, and Becky was talking about it, and I think police forces are moving towards it, definitely.
One thing that you and I have talked about before as it relates to this is the mental wellness of our investigators. And you know, a lot of times, I know you've had some experience in some major cases, but in any investigation, I think people forget that first responders are humans too, and so there's the potential of kind of secondary and vicarious trauma of being surrounded by this incident and being told these stories over and over again. So any thoughts or strategies around how do we take care of the investigators and the responders to these cases?
Yeah, so we have a thing here. I don't know what it's like there, but when I joined the police, there was bits of welfare like that. I still think the culture of policing was probably still sort of suck it up, don't show it. I think policing here now is massively improved in that area. So it was certainly things that I thought about as an interview advisor. I thought about the welfare of the interviewer. If you're going to interview somebody who's witnessed, a horrible incident, and maybe you're interviewing multiple people who have seen horrible things, so we would have part of the interview strategy would also be about support as well. So, you interview somebody, they pour out, these memories, and then we're not just going to send them off. We're going to have a sort of strategy in place, sort of a welfare part of it afterwards. So we have people here called trim practitioners who are sort of like police officers and staff who are sort of trained to support and do referrals here. But yeah, I believe in that sort of quite passionately, and I'm not ashamed to say there were times in the police where you were low and you're with people on their worst days. They might only have one bad day, but you've got to listen to multiple people have their worst days. So you've got to look after welfare, and if you look at sort of guidance now for even like senior investigating officers, it's not just about managing an investigation anymore, it's about you're responsible for the welfare of your staff. So yeah, again, that WISCI makes reference to that, about trauma, and it also makes reference to sort of like those who are conducting the interviews, especially like in a TOIA, sort of some of the feedback around them. So being aware, and I think that's a big thing about being an interview advisor, from my opinion, is that elevates you to that level, is that you're aware of things like that. You're not just thinking about getting somebody to talk, you're thinking about welfare, you're thinking about trauma, you're thinking about building rapport, you're thinking about opening questions, you're thinking about the way, maybe even the way they dress, the way they address the person. It's all strategy. It's not secret tricks, it's nothing, it's just you're now thinking, how am I going to let this person, whether they're a suspect or a witness, give their best information to me, and also look after them, but look after the people who are doing it as well.
Yeah, that's really good. And we talked a lot about strategy beforehand, and I think of equal importance is the evaluation after the interview, which I know is a shortcoming in a lot of investigators. And again, any difficult conversation you're going to have with somebody, even if it's with a coworker, you got to talk to somebody about their performance or whatever it might be. And we plan it, hopefully, we have the conversation, and then often the conversation's over and we just go back to another task versus let's reflect and kind of evaluate what we just did. So I think that's an important piece that often gets missed, that I know an advisor role would help play a role in. As you're educating kind of the next wave of investigators and students right now, and to kind of wrap us up for our listeners, what are some of those key takeaways that you want people to leave with, and maybe the students you're working with or practitioners you're working with, to be better, just effective communicators?
I think what I like anyone to think about is not the outcome of something. I like them to think about the decision making that took place before that. So when I talk in the realm of communication, it's all. I think a lot of investigative work, whether it's policing or corporate, or you're a school teacher and you're trying to find out who broke the window at school by kicking the football through or something like that. I think all of it's about decision making that leads you up until that point. So for me, I want everyone to, whether they're somebody I'm training, if they're a student at university or in personal life, is to sort of understand the impacts on their decision making, and for everything to be justifiable later. And what I mean by that is that when it comes under scrutiny later, they can sort of go, that was fair. I understood. So I had a student in, I thought they'd smashed the window. I had quite good evidence that they'd done it. Maybe they're going to get thrown. You're not going to get expelled for kicking a football against a window, but there could be some consequences for them. The manner in which I approached it, I wasn't judgmental. The questions I asked were based on facts. There was, I had evidence that the student was in the area at the time. The football has got his initials on or something like that. When later it comes out that it was someone else, and somebody says, James, you were, why did you bring that kid in? You were quite harsh on him. Well, I wasn't harsh. Actually, this was my thinking behind it. So I think that, in a bit of a long-winded way, I teach my students about decision making, the impacts on decision making. We learn from the failings of the past. Rather than just criticising them, try and understand, put yourself in the shoes of the investigators at the time, so that when they're faced in similar situations in the future, they can learn from that, they understand the decision making, they can justify it. I think that's my era, that you can say that you were fair. I've come back to that word. I just think that's really important in policing and everything. It's about being fair.
Fair and just, which is a good way to wrap us up. It's been a really interesting conversation. You and I could, I'm sure, talk for hours about some of these kind of core concepts. So maybe we'll come back for a second edition of this one. But I appreciate your time today, and for all the advice you gave us. We'll definitely link in the show notes some information about WISCI. I know James is also heavily involved with IRG, the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group. So we'll link that as well. It's a great association that I'm a part of, and love to go to their event. So they do really good things for the industry as well. So we appreciate everything you're doing for the space.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And I just wanted to say as well, I think, perhaps over this side of the Atlantic, when we sort of heard of investigative interviewing and practices in America, there was always historically a bit of an eye roll, and we hear it, but just WZ and sort of the work you guys do, and your programs. I'm not just trying. Dave hasn't slipped me some money to say this, but I think it's really good that an organisation like yourself are promoting the sort of things that you do. And so yeah, just from my part, thanks for having me. And I think the message that you guys send out, your course is fantastic. So from my side,
appreciate it. Changing the world one truth be told episode at a time. Yeah. Well, thanks, James, and thank you all for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. To help more listeners find our show, please provide us a rating, give us a follow, and share this episode with your colleagues. For the latest news and to engage with our guests, follow Truth Be Told on your favorite social media apps, and don't forget, we are available on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and watch a video of this episode on YouTube. On behalf of our guests and valued sponsors, thanks again for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.